Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of 2025 of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre. With me is Z, and hopefully everyone had a good holiday break. I remember we talked a little bit about it before we went on it, but for me at least, it was just kind of a good period to chill out. Didn't really do too much. I did check out some of the CCC talks, but didn't end up going to any conferences or anything. Did a bit of skiing and some family stuff, and yeah, it was a pretty good break for me, and I believe you're in the same boat, right? See?
Yeah, for the most part. It was a good break. It was so good we took an extra week before coming back,
Yeah.
but we are back on it. Yeah, I mean, for me, I kind of unexpectedly ended up jumping into a bit of Minecraft hacking. At least getting started. I'm trying to get some fuzzing going and doing some other stuff with that, but yeah, I kind of randomly ended up into that as a little side project for myself, which I definitely didn't intend on doing when we started that break, but found
Yeah,
myself going
so
down that path.
you'd actually talked to me a little bit about this, but I think maybe it would be interesting even to some people who listen to us if you went into a little bit more of the detail there, because it might be something that some people would be interested in getting into themselves, because it sounded very interesting to me.
Yeah, so I guess I kind of the rundown of it is I joined what's called, I guess, Minecraft Anarchy server. I don't know what all the different types are. Another term I see is like SMP and survival and whatever. I don't know all the types, but basically it's a server where you're allowed to hack on. So it basically makes the programming, the modding side of things just part of the game, part of the fun, and some where I can then take the kind of skills I already have, try and apply them into Minecraft and use that use that knowledge to not necessarily break the game. The particular server 2B2T does patch some bugs, so it's not like a complete free for all and absolutely everything. But that's only once the bugs are disclosed. So kind of taking a stab at finding my own like bugs to duplicate items, for example, or there's some movement hacks. I haven't looked at that very much yet at all. And things for just like spotting where people are hiding, things like almost looking for, in a sense, side channels.
I was
Kind
about
of
to
a
say you're almost like side channeling the game engine for the
Yeah,
server.
because one of the things I spent some time on was, I guess, when Minecraft does generation of like these different structures, it'll generate this thing called cave air. And this wasn't like a secret that nobody knew about. It's been talked about a little bit that there could be some exploit with that. And exploit in this case just means like abuse of the fact that that's there. But when you actually like place a place a block and break it, it'll get replaced with normal air. So I wrote a little scanner that'll look for blocks of cave air. Then like this unexpected block of normal air is like a sign that somebody was here. And so that became a likely sign of, well, somebody maybe placed some of their important items in this random chest that most people would just skip over. And it's kind of using those almost like side channels like that. And I kind of came up with a couple other very trivial things, but yeah, I've just been kind of exploring things, and where I want to kind of go is looking at probably trying to do some more like duplication bugs so I can duplicate some of my important items. So I want to look at trying to set up like fuzzing going and some other things there, but it is it is Java based, so yeah, the fuzzing tooling is different, and kind of the setup need there. It's not as nice as what we've got when it comes to the binary memory corruption stuff, but yeah, it's been an interesting area to look into.
Yeah, I remember you talking about wanting to look into like raise conditions with item duping, and there could be a lot of fun stuff you could do with that for sure.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the past bugs that have had duplication issues have been related to just race conditions around certain transition points, be it breaking a storage item and taking an item at the same time, or like changing dimensions in game. While I wonder if I'm involved like a donkey carrying an item, dying when it went through this portal that will change dimensions, then like um it would, or the item it had would duplicate or whatever. I'm explaining that poorly because I haven't looked into that one in particular, but like it has the vibes of being just race conditions where you've got multiple actors acting on that same information, one changes something and it doesn't get synced to the other quite in time. Those are fairly old bugs that have been known about or have been patched for a long time. But it kind of gives me the indication that there probably are other race condition style bugs going on within the game, which makes sense. Being a game trying to do massive locking, for example, isn't really going to be the most performant thing to do. Although
Yeah,
in
although
fairness, Java makes it pretty easy with like the synchronized keyword and stuff.
I was about to say I could see like the tick granularity, as I understand it, on in Minecraft at least, is fairly low granularity. Like you could, like if you synchronize to a tick, like you should be able to avoid races in a lot of cases, right? Like you don't really have things going on between ticks to the same degree, right?
Yeah,
Maybe
so I
my
think
understanding's wrong. I haven't done a lot of like Minecraft hacking.
yes, my understanding with some of these has been like you need to have these actions happen the same tick, and so it kind of comes down to what order the actions happen in during the tick. And when some of those, like if some of those updates say happen post tick or pre tick, as you can kind of register the event as being before or after in that sense. And so, yeah, there is a certain degree of granularity that does offer some protection for some types of things, but still, it feels like a number of the bugs. At least that's my theory. Like literally, this is last couple weeks I've been looking at this. Like I'm definitely not an expert on what's there. That's just the thing I kind of noticed. And if you've listened to the podcast, race conditions are one of those fun bug classes that I like to see and like to talk about.
Yeah, and I mean the other thing we talk about a lot is how good of a like a motivator or vehicle that game hacking can be for doing security stuff, and it's just a very fun thing to do, and it can keep you motivated where otherwise you find lots of frustration. Because like
Yeah.
you said, like even with Minecraft, I mean there's going to be some frustration with doing that, like debugging and introspection, where the tooling isn't as readily available as a lot of other stuff. But yeah, I mean it sounds really interesting, and I want to try to get a bit more into some hacking stuff too. Not really cheat development, because a lot of cheat development is really boring, honestly. It's a lot of like copy paste and like the same kind of tricks that like malware is using and whatever. But yeah, like actually doing like messing with game engines and going deep into that level uh is kind of fun, especially in like multiplayer context like Minecraft, where you have like open servers and stuff like that. And I mean it's cool that there are these anarchy servers that you can go in to do this stuff, where it's not like frowned upon, or it's kind of expected that that's happening. I wasn't even really aware of them. I'm not huge into Minecraft, so I wasn't aware that those types of servers even existed, but it's very cool.
Yeah, that's kind of the thing that appeals to me a little bit is the fact that, it's just rather than seeing it as cheating, it's another dimension to the gameplay. It's just
Yeah.
another take, it's another part of it. And as long as people are okay with that, like, obviously I understand when somebody's not going to enjoy it if somebody were to do the same thing on like, a more vanilla server and expecting to be or not expecting to have any sort of cheats being used or stuff. Like I totally get somebody not wanting that, but here's an environment where it seems okay. It seems like it's just part of the game. So yeah, it just adds a new dimension to the gameplay for me that at least appeals to me.
Yeah. Yeah, very cool. Unfortunately, I don't have nearly as much like fun stuff to talk about. Like I said, I mostly just kind of chilled. I did some skiing and whatever. I didn't really do a lot on the computer. In fact, like the week of Christmas and New Year's, I was like not really on the PC much, or at least when I wasn't really doing, like programming or hacking or anything like that. So, but yeah, I mean that's, sometimes you just need a bit of a break and try to avoid burnout, which
Yeah.
always seems to hit me around this time of year. So, uh,
Yeah, with winter setting in and, you know, days getting shorter, it's easy to kind of fall into a bit of a gloom or a stump
yeah,
or whatever.
yes, especially when you're in, the frozen wastelands of Canada, where you get like 6 hours of sunlight for 2 months. 6 hours of sunlight a day, but still not 6 hours spread over 2 months. But yeah, it can be a little tough, and trying to manage that a little bit. So Yeah, but like I said, one thing I did do was I checked out some of the CCC talks. I didn't check them out live because I kind of like with everything going on, I kind of forgot they were happening. But then I remembered on like New Year's Day, I was like, oh wait, CCC happened. I should go check out those talks. Um, so yeah, there's quite a few interesting talks. There's three of them specifically that I've managed to get around to listening to. So I figured I would call them out here. So one that I enjoyed was From Pegasus to Predator: The Evolution of Commercial Spyware on iOS. So this doesn't really get into the uh legalities or anything like that of spyware. It's purely technical. It has a lot of stuff from like Amnesty, Citizen Lab, and Access Now, some stuff from Tag as well. Just kind of a collection of how spyware has evolved over the years and the different evasion techniques they use. Some of the ways that you can try to detect spyware, even as someone who's not like a someone who's deep into iOS research. They kind of talk about like the different tooling that's been created that you can use. So yeah, there's just a lot of cool information there. It's very accessible, even though a lot of the iOS technicals aren't super accessible if you're not in that area already. It's a bit more like surface level, just talking about the steps that malware takes to like try to stay hidden and whatever. It doesn't go super deep on it, but I found it very interesting. So I thought I would call that out. Another one that I enjoyed, just as kind of a fun one, was 10 years of emulating the Nintendo 3DS. So I obviously have a bit of a connection to console hacking. I don't do Nintendo, I do PlayStation, but it's all very similar. Now, this one, unlike the last one, isn't so much technical, but it talks a little bit more about the managerial challenges of managing emulation of such a complicated system. How you have like different pieces that have to come together in the right way. Um, and like some of the challenges that you have with different approaches you take from emulation. So, for example, like doing like full system emulation where you try to emulate the hardware as opposed to like surface level emulation where you just try to implement like stubs and libraries and do it that way. Just talking a lot about the things learned from taking different approaches, and ultimately it focuses on the Citrus project towards the beginning, which I believe is like the older 3DS emulator, and the newer one, sorry, not Citrus, Citra, and the newer one, Mikage. So, yeah, if you're into console hacking, game hacking, I think this will definitely be an interesting talk to you.
Yeah, when you
Uh,
say the managerial aspects, like I assume you're talking kind of like is still at the code level, yeah, not like the legal and like management
kind
of the
of
actual
both,
team, or
actually.
okay.
So they do actually talk about like some of the drama that you can have in emulation scenes and how like people not wanting to work together or share code can cause problems. One specific case they talk about with Citra was a lot of developers that worked on Citra got very jaded because people would just like fork the project and integrate uh, commits that had been worked on in development for a while, but they were, because they wanted it to be a high quality project, they were going through and trying to make these commits really good and everything before actually committing them to the project. But because there were impatient people who really wanted these features, people would basically like fork the repo, put those commits in. They were like half broken. They broke like half the games that worked on the emulator, and then they would push it forward as like, and because of that, like a lot of people who worked on Citra were just like, screw it, I don't want to do it anymore, or they would like take their work private. So it does talk about like the people aspect of it too, and some of the drama and just general crap you have to deal with emulation, unfortunately,
Okay.
and
Fair
kind of
enough.
like how they're trying to manage those problems with like their release style and all that stuff. So yeah, I thought it was a very interesting talk
Yeah, sounds cool.
because
There's definitely a lot kind of in that scene that I think is non-obvious.
yeah.
Kind of especially around some of the drama that happens around the console scenes.
Yeah, because that's the really interesting thing is like if you just look at the technical details of emulation, there's been quite a lot of talks and blog posts about it, and it really is just like keep trying things and like reverse the existing code and try to re-implement functionality. It's really about the grind and just putting the work in for the most part. But when it comes to how do you actually manage a project like that where you have like a lot of different ideas and voices and perspectives. That's where I don't think there's as much information about that's like well presented. So yeah, that was definitely the part that I found interesting about it. Another talk that might sound like it's a little bit out of left field that I found interesting was UX for hackers. So this was by Marta. I don't want to try to say the rest of her name. I will butcher it. But she works as a UX, like the head of UX at CubesOS. And it's sort of an interesting thing because the main like focus or premise of her talk is the fact that a lot of people who hack on things just don't care about UX or are sometimes outright like snide about UX and being like, oh, if you can't use my tool, then that's a skill issue. Get good. If you don't understand how to use my tool, it's your problem, not mine. And the whole idea of this talk is like, no, that's not a great way of thinking, and it unfortunately prevents a lot of people from collaborating with you or like using your tooling where they might otherwise. Like, if you put all this effort into it and the UX sucks, it almost makes it like, what was the point if nobody wants to use it, right? So she goes through and talks about some of like trying to tackle that perspective, as well as talking about like the common types of UX issues you can have and how you can go about addressing them. She mostly uses examples from CubesOS. So like looking at older versions of CubesOS where they felt like they failed in UX and where you can improve on it. So I thought that was really interesting. Um,
Yeah,
kind
this
of
is a
using
talk
cubes as a
that
vehicle.
you mentioned earlier, just when we were talking about this before. And I meant to take a look at this. I did not. I haven't listened to it yet. I will get around to it. But yeah, UX, it's one of those areas that is really easy to ignore because generally speaking, you don't notice good UX. You notice when it's really bad. You notice when things go
Yeah.
wrong, you can't do things. But good UX is something you just, in a sense, don't necessarily put thought into. And you kind of see it when there's kind of the classic idea of like the back end developer, the programmer, the hacker doesn't know how to design like the UX, the front end, doesn't know how to do that, or just does like really simple work. And that's definitely true for me. Like I put a little bit of care sometimes into design, but not necessarily enough. It's one of those kind of areas that I'm more focused on the technical, on just making it work and making it work for me, and less about how the usability.
Yeah, it's sort of an afterthought. Like it's like, oh,
Yeah.
this is something I have to deal with. I don't want to deal with it, so I'll just do the bare minimum
Yeah,
for a
and
lot of
so
people.
I think it's definitely a worthwhile like thing to bring some insight onto, because we kind of mentioned there where in a sense it can become like a badge of honor to be a user of something unusable, where you've got I won't mention any tools, but you've definitely got that feeling of the people who have mastered and really use this thing just make it sound like, as you said, kind of it's skill issue if you're not using it, if you're not good enough. And if you haven't taken the time to read the man pages and know absolutely everything and all the side effects, whatever, then it's your fault. There is, I think, a degree of truth in terms of doing like the research and actually take some time to read what's available, but there is also a bit of blame that can be put onto the development side to make the necessary functionality visible and usable, without necessarily requiring you spend X hours researching it too. So yeah, this is
Yeah.
one I do want to kind of circle back on and actually watch for myself, but I haven't yet.
Yeah, and I'll add like even beyond some of the weird ego issues, she calls out like it can be really hard to make a good UX because when you're designing something, everything that you're going to make is going to be intuitive to you. It's hard to break out of your own head and try to look at it like, how would someone else who isn't familiar with my project gonna feel about trying to use it? In order to like, you really can't do it all on your own. You kind of need to involve some other people from outside the project to give some feedback and kind of have that work cycle. But where you kind of have a conflict because a lot of like hacking tools are just kind of whipped up quickly, like, oh, I'm going to use this. I'm going to use this to like this script to pull firmware or something. It works for me. Good enough. Um, Like it's just, yeah, you
And
you
we
kind
do
of have
still
that
need things
conflict.
like that too. Like I do
For
want to
sure.
be clear that like those really quick tools and just putting them out there, even though like you haven't polished out the US, that like I'm not hating on anybody for doing that. I've done it myself plenty where it's just like, this is a tool I wrote for me. Maybe somebody's going to find some use for it. I am thinking about more established tools that have tried to, bring more than just I wrote this really quickly for me.
Yeah.
Um, like there, I couldn't draw a line in the sand on exactly where that transition happens, but I do see there being a difference. Like we still need people just kind of putting out whatever they're working on as like inspiration, as just like here's my thought or here's my crazy idea or whatever. Or I don't
Yeah.
want to come across as being like you shouldn't do that. You need to spend all your time on UX first or something. I'm definitely not taking that stance.
Yeah, and to be clear, like I'm not trying to take any high ground position. There are plenty of stuff that I have put out on GitHub or whatever that people struggle to use, and I've always just said like, "Oh, I'll go back and make it easier and make it better," and I just don't because it's hard to go back on like older projects and make them better and work on the UX because it like you said, it's a thankless task for the most part. You're not really getting praise for having good UX. It's what people expect, even though it's hard to do. Um so yeah, I thought it was a very interesting talk. It goes into some of the like psychology and everything of design and UX, and I think everyone would benefit from watching this talk and just having like some of these points in mind when they're writing things. Just being aware of it, I think, would help quite a bit in making tools and the security space and everything more usable. So yeah, that was the three talks that I found interesting. Z, I know you had a couple talks that you wanted to talk about too, so I'll let you get into that.
Yeah, I checked out a few talks. For the most part, not the most technical talks, but still they were ones that at least caught my eye. First one was What the Fuzz. And that is PHUZZ. Because I know there's also What the Fuzz, like Snapshot Fuzzer. So not that. This is about finding 0 days in web applications with coverage guided fuzzing. And I kind of actually hinted at this toward when talking about Minecraft there, where fuzzing in that environment, when it comes to binary work, like we often fuzz for crashes and you introduce like maybe you have a sanitizer, you have some hooking going on, whatever, to introduce crashes so that you can like detect certain bugs. And when it comes to the web, you have, or well, when it comes generally to web technology, when it comes to these safer languages, fuzzing has like you've got something like fuzz faster, you fool, where you basically are just testing like your randomized strings. Like you're not getting the same sort of very intelligent fuzzing that you see on the binary side. And it's kind of a challenge because you do have to figure like how do you detect the vulnerabilities? How do you even just providing inputs can be a little bit more challenging because the structure is kind of different, being a more server oriented setup rather than being able to say call into a library. I mean, you do have C applications that do networking too, so it's not entirely different, but like the whole setup is a bit different and just comes across as a bit more limited. So what they're looking at here is just basically applying coverage guide fuzzing. They have a few other things when it comes to like detecting the issues, just kind of write basically they were writing hooks on things so they can catch like when a silence or a suppressed exception happens in PHP. They'd be able to like detect that as like, oh, there's like a SQL injection issue here, but they're just suppressing the error and a few little things like that. But ultimately, I did find it a little bit interesting. One of the goals here was also making it a little bit easy, so they have like a whole trying to find the slide here, but a whole thing where you know basically just generates the fuzzer configuration stuff into like Docker Compose. And so you can kind of stand up the application. So you don't have to modify either like PHP engine. This was specific to PHP and how they're doing it. But you don't have to modify that, don't have to modify the target source code in order to do the fuzzing. So there's kind of a couple benefits over some other things there. But it's just nice to see progress in this area because fuzzing is or has been rather powerful and rather effective for finding issues. and it hasn't really been used very well, in my opinion, on the website because a lot of it is just reminiscent of just kind of your black box random fuzzer of the old days when it came to binary stuff, just tossing the random inputs, going for a crash. You kind of have the same deal going on with a lot of web fuzzers where it's just, maybe you'll do a little bit of crawling to get the parameters or mining for parameters and then just tossing all your test cases at it and letting it go and not really having the intelligence behind how it's like what it's writing, how the mutations are happening, and a lot of the growth that
Yeah,
we've seen. So yeah, I like seeing research here, and this is just kind of one step on that.
yeah, like not really leveraging the grammar based fuzzing as much, which is kind of funny because like the browser space has been the proponent of that for a long time, and you would think it would be fairly easily transferable, at least on that aspect of it. In terms of like the debugging and the introspection and sanitization, like that's a little bit harder. But what I thought was a little bit interesting was the PHP focus. So you said most of this was PHP. Now, PHP is like a fair thing to test around and whatnot, but is it really that like I don't think it's really that common in terms of like newer things on the server side being written in PHP, right? Like you kind of have the
Oh,
Node.js being the dominant force now, and that would be where I would be a bit more interested in seeing some of the like some of this kind of fuzzing. But
that is a oddly controversial topic. Um,
okay, maybe
yeah,
I shouldn't
so
stir up the hornet's nest.
well,
I'm not really like as integrated into web dev as I was like maybe 10 years ago, where PHP was still pretty popular. I had thought like just from my outside perspective that it was almost in the same class as Perl now. But maybe that's a mistake.
so the thing is, PHP is still insanely like by the numbers, PHP is still like one of the most popular languages being used on the web today. Problem
Because
is
of the
a
fact
lot
there's a
of
lot of older stuff still.
yes.
Yeah.
And so yeah, like my feeling is, and I think a lot of developers tend to agree with this sentiment, is like, yeah, like new projects aren't really coming up in PHP. There's still some PHP development. Like it's not like PHP development is dead. There's still things going on in that scene, but generally it's not the language of choice for like any sort of new project where something
Yeah.
like JavaScript would. I'm right with you there, but whenever I see comments where somebody's like, "Oh, PHP is dead, PHP isn't popular anymore," whatever, there's always people who chime in about how it's like the most popular language. Most web servers are running PHP and all of this, which is also true, but it's also different targets than what I think most of us are. If you're working as a
Yeah.
pen tester, if you've got a bug bounty, even a lot of those targets are going to be the targets written on something newer and not the same thing just running your random old PHP target.
Yeah, I feel like it's one of those things where it's factually true, but you're doing a bit of a disingenuous framing when you say it that way. Because, like, I'm thinking of all of the web topics that we've covered over the last couple of years, and sure, PHP has factored into some of them. I don't want to say PHP is completely not used anymore, but for the most part, you're talking about like Node.js or like some JS framework being used. You don't really see PHP being used to the same degree that it was like 10 years ago or something. And I just haven't really seen a lot of like buzzing on that side for like even Node.js stuff. We've seen like some like automated testing, but again, you're like you were saying, that's kind of just like throwing test cases and previous bugs at it. It's not really like the fuzzing that you see classically in binary world. So
Yeah, and I think some of this could perhaps be applied elsewhere when it comes to mutation, when it comes so it starts off with, crawling for endpoints and stuff. Like that's the sort of thing that could be applied over onto any fuzzer. And then trying to get coverage collection is going to be a little bit more based on particular language
mhm.
and kind of all of that. So that part is kind of PHP focused. But the idea of like hooking for vulnerability detection, you could do that in JavaScript too. Like there's a lot of things you could apply even if you're not taking this specific, because this is a more academic post. Like I believe there is an actual paper associated with this that was presented at some conferences, academic conferences. So this is kind of that sort of presentation. That like it's the idea that you can run with.
So yeah, so a fair amount of it is probably transferable. Okay.
That's my feeling. At least there are some takeaways that I can get out of this, not looking at PHP. So I feel like there are takeaways, but yeah, like the code itself they do publish, and like that you'd be copying here would be PHP centric.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah, then moving off of that one, the other talk I took a look at here was OMG WTF SSO, a beginner's guide to SSO misconfiguration. And it's basically what the title said, beginner's guide to SSO misconfiguration. There's no real fancy new research here. It's talking about SSO, what it is, why it's used, how things go wrong, how things get misconfigured, some of the common issues there. I'd say this is probably real, like, especially on Bug Bounty. I think we've seen a number of SSO issues being reported on like HackerOne and stuff, or at least of the type that's talked about here, that have had some really good impact on, or we've covered those being reported through HackerOne. So like if you're on Bug Bounty, could be interesting. I just thought it was a well done presentation covering kind of the basics there. If you're already an expert, you're maybe not going to get a lot out of it, but still, I thought it was a pretty solid presentation and not really a lot to say in specific outfit. Like it's doing what the title says. And then the last talk I started going through, I haven't actually finished on this one, but I'll still call it out, was how election software can fail. Back in the early days of the podcast, I used to try and find some of these election issues to talk about a little bit. It's one of the topics I kind of care about a bit when it comes to technology around our elections and around voting and all of that. Specifically, this was around Netherlands. Talks about some of the issues that they actually saw happen, how they dealt with them, because these weren't like, oh my gosh, all the votes are missed or something. Like it was nothing major in that sense. But it was still interesting. I see one from an insider perspective of how some of the things ran and stuff. And as I said, I haven't actually finished this, so I can't go into all the details, but what was covered there, but still just kind of taking a look at election software in general, some of the IT behind it, some of the issues that have come up, the language choices, some of that. I just found it a little bit interesting to see some of the issues there, but
Yeah, I mean it's funny because you were talking about the early days of the podcast, and I remember for a while there, uh, electronic voting and elections were huge in just the discussion at that time. I remember when DEF CON had voting machines that uh, they had like an election hacking village, and I think it even got like some mainstream news coverage. It was a pretty big thing, and like elections, especially on the scale of larger countries, are just really hard. Like they have a lot of complexities and potential ways for abuse, that have made people kind of rightfully skeptical of electronic voting. And it's really interesting seeing some of the ways that have been approached for dealing with it. I remember when we used to read some of the white papers and some of the like crypto schemes that they came up with to try to like guarantee the integrity of voting systems. And it's a little bit outside of my area. I don't fully understand all of it, but it is very interesting to get the insight into. And with this person having had that experience on the inside of it, I'm sure there's a lot of like really useful insights there.
yeah, and they do actually talk, I guess, actually about some of the times voting computers have come up at past C3 conferences, not so much I don't think they mentioned the DEF CON ones.
Yeah, that was just one that came to mind because I
But
think the first year I went to DEF CON in 2019, that was when that was kind of taking off.
yeah, and they don't really go into, so when you're talking about the crypto stuff, that's getting more towards the verified voting realm of things, which
Mhm.
is kind of an area I believe in, but I don't think we're really going to see, or that society will really accept, because that's uh there are different approaches on it, but like approaching or like, involving homomorphic encryption into voting, like people aren't going to understand that enough to trust it, even if it is trustworthy. So there's a whole thing there. But yeah, this is more on like the voting computers and tallying software and kind of that sort of work. Some of the software that's around it, even if the votes may still be cast on like the paper ballots and such. Oh, it's like They might have that and then software comes into play a little bit. It's covering a slightly different area, I think, than what our older kind of focus was, but still some interesting points out of it so far. Like I said, I haven't finished it, so I don't want to make any conclusive statements on it. But it was another one that I was at least checking out.
Yeah, there's a few other CCC talks that I would like to try to get around to checking out. There's quite a lot of them. Unfortunately, some of the ones that I thought were kind of interesting, like on the hardware hacking side, are not in English. They're in German. Um, but yeah, there's a fair amount of good talks that I think are worth checking out. I'm sure a lot of our listeners have probably already looked and watched some talks, but those are the ones that we found interesting. Continuing on things that have popped up over the years in our podcast coverage, there was also a summary judgment on the WhatsApp versus NSO Group civil suit that was going on, and this was pretty relevant. And there's been discussions the times that it's came up in our Discord, because it does, or it can potentially have some impact on security research as a whole, where it comes to vuln research and exploit development. Now, this case is a little bit different. They did avoid some of the like technicality and legalese on that, but still there was some interesting things to come out of it. Z has been following this fairly closely and looked into the legal documents a little more, so I'll let him get into the specifics.
Yeah, and I should say that while we got a summary judgment in part on this case, basically the in part was deciding on whether or not NSO Group actually had liability for some of the damages, and they had liability under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. The case is still ongoing, but what they're doing now is deciding how much damages are and all of that, which is less interesting to me. And even with the summary judgment that just came out, there's technically a few things in that were determined, and the main thing of interest to me through all of this has been about how the CFAA, Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, gets interpreted to apply to NSO Group here, especially where you've got this case between WhatsApp and NSO Group. If you're familiar with how a lot of these messenger application vulnerabilities work, and we've talked about some of the WhatsApp bugs before, where it's like a bug in, I believe one that we covered was an I mean, we've definitely covered MP4 bugs. I believe one of them impacted WhatsApp also, where you'd have a user, they would send a MP4 to a user, to another WhatsApp user. Their phone would download that MP4, process it, and in processing it, there'd be, some vulnerability, out of bounds, right, whatever. Some vulnerability would exist such that they were then able to compromise the end user's phone. And so
Yeah.
from the beginning, this case felt a little bit weird because this is WhatsApp suing NSO Group under, or at least in part here, under Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, so claiming that NSO Group had unauthorized access or exceeded authorization of access to WhatsApp for sending a malicious message via WhatsApp to somebody else. This is not the case of somebody who had their phone compromised by NSO Group making the claim that they were hacked. This is WhatsApp claiming they were hacked because the malicious message passed through there. And so that felt like there was the chance that the way the judgment could come is that would be interpreted as, yeah, because your message went through this server, even though it did not attack or compromise WhatsApp in any way, because it passed through their server, and terms of service say you can't do this, therefore it's unauthorized access and Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. That was ruled out pretty early on, that merely violating terms of service would not be sufficient. That was back in 2020, and this case started back in 2019. It's taken so long because NSO Group, Israeli company, works with the Israeli government. They made a immunity claim fairly early on that they had sovereign immunity, and so the charges can be brought. That had to, and when there's an immunity claim, basically the whole trial, everything stops. They settle this immunity claim, which went through both judgment here, hit the appellate courts, and they also tried to get it taken by the Supreme Court. It wasn't, so it kind of stopped there. But so that took the intervening years, and that was back in I think it was just this summer where that was finally settled so they can come back onto this trial. So it's taken a while. And ultimately, I'm going to pull up the judgment here, which is 494. This is just the kind of the judge's statement on the motion for summary judgment. If you are interested, dockets 421 and 425 have both, though. 425 is WhatsApp's arguments, and 421 are the NSO arguments kind of for their side. You kind of have one nice thing about having all of the documents here is you can see the arguments, you can see exactly what they're making claims of. One of the challenges is there's a lot of redactions that go on throughout, especially in the arguments where they're making specific claims, and NSO Group especially did not want certain pieces of information out there and were able to file things with redactions. Apparently, you might be able to pay on Pacer to get like the original document, but I wasn't going to do that. So in this judgment here, first big dispute is on the CFAA. Again, I'm mostly interested about the CFAA stuff. There are other things going on here, like California's computer fraud, or version of it also, which they talk about. So they call out the core reason that because all WhatsApp users are authorized to send messages, defendants did not act without authorization by sending their messages, even though they contain spyware. So that is a good judgment. Like, as much as I don't want to agree with, like, say NSO should have, like, you know, free reign on anything here, it's still, like, you know, even doing, actually, why don't I pull up, I'm going to pull up the WhatsApp arguments here, because part of the argument just hinge on the fact that NSO Group created a false client and therefore was violating terms of service and was exceeding their authorized access because their client could send packets that the original client could not. Therefore, it's illegal. And that feels like a stretch of any sort of Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Okay, I said it was document 425, but that looks like I just made a mistake here because that is definitely not it. So yeah, and just pulling up the actual argument. So to be clear, this is what the attorneys for like WhatsApp and for NSO Group were claiming. This is not necessarily what the judge actually agreed, like, is proper defense. Like, if you read the judgment, in some cases they dealt directly with what the argument was. In some cases they made the claim like, we don't need to deal with this question or whatever is raised here, or they didn't rate, like, whatever goes on there. And so two documents of interest actually here are 422 and document 421. I had given some numbers earlier, 421 and 425. That 425 is definitely incorrect. But yeah, one of their arguments basically just came down to NSO Group created a application that was not original and may have been trafficking in password, which is another thing controlled by CFAA, because they use like a private key that's generated during this. Basically, I'm rambling, but a whole lot of things could have come down off of this that had an interpretation that would have hindered legitimate security research. Because one of the problems with the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is the Department of Justice just a couple years ago basically said, and this is literally like, you know, maybe 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, we're not going to charge people for good faith security research. But what they're saying is they could charge people for good faith security research. It's just a policy that they won't. The law
Yeah, it's just
allows
trust
them.
me, basically.
Yeah, exactly. They could change policy anytime because they want to make an example of you or of somebody. So, you know, the law still allows. The law has no exception for good faith security research. So when NSO Group, if they get hit for like just making a custom application to interact with the software and that becomes a CFAA violation, then, like, you know, somebody who makes their Discord, makes their own Discord application or something, maybe not going through the proper channels for it, is that a CFAA violation? And so that was my concern with this judgment, and it did not come down in a way that would allow that. So I am glad about that. And that was one of the big things that I was kind of watching for with this case.
Yeah. Now, I do know with lawsuits, both in like criminal and civil, you kind of like throw everything at the wall and see what sticks, so to speak. Like you try to throw a bunch of arguments and you're not really expecting all of them to go through. You're just trying to get some of them through. But and the other thing is like where this is a civil case, I think you had mentioned this in the Discord, but the burden of proof and everything is a bit lower, and I'm not sure if it would really be treated as a precedent in the same way.
No, and I mean precedent is really so again, not a lawyer. So that
Yeah,
caveat
we're
needs to be
idiots
there.
talking about legal matters.
Yeah, I just, I care because we've seen over the years Computer Fraud and Abuse Act be abused and get some pretty insane charges for some pretty benign things because the law is just vaguely written as like exceeds or like exceeds authorized acts or unauthorized acts without really being clear. And actually, even part of this case kind of came down to kind of had a semantic issue over just uh let me see if I can find. Yeah, it kind of came down to this part here, section A2 itself, which imposes liability on whoever accesses a computer in excess of authorized access and thereby obtains information from any protected computer. So that's where they were to make the claim about NSO Group here. They accessed a computer in excess of their authorized access. They accessed WhatsApp in excess of, something there, some authorization, and then obtained information from a protected computer, that being the device that was actually compromised, because they kind of proxied through WhatsApp. They were able to make the claim, which fair enough, it is written in that way. Like I can uh kind of understand there, although they do kind of mention no party cites any case law. And as you were just mentioning, Spectre, with regards to precedent, my understanding on precedent is that at this level court, like this first level of court, generally speaking, like you should respect what other courts are making, but you can't, judges can kind of make their own decision. It's the appellate court where that kind of sets the precedent for all of the lower courts. Similarly, the Supreme Court would set the precedent for like all of the courts. So even if it were ruled here, like it would then become something that another judge can look at and be like, see, they ruled like this here, therefore I'm going to do the same. But I think they do have some flexibility on that until like the appellate courts. And at least that's my understanding of how that aspect works. And yeah, this is a civil case. This is not a legal case. Nobody's actually being charged with the crime here. This is for determining liability. Like WhatsApp is suing, I think, for $75,000 over $75,000 of damages. Like it's not actually that big of a number when it comes to their damages here.
Yeah, typically when you see a company that's as large as like WhatsApp or Meta going after people, you would expect a larger damages figure. It seems like they were just trying to see what they could get through, I guess, more so.
This felt like they more just wanted to go after Pegasus and get information about Pegasus, which of course
Yeah,
NSO Group
doesn't want.
they did provide some stuff, but they were not like participating very well in the discovery process, and that does get called out, and that also leads to some rulings against them where it can just be assumed like they didn't prove otherwise, therefore guilty sort of deal. Well, not guilty, wrong word, therefore liable or whatever.
Liable, yeah.
Yeah. I did find it interesting. So in the initial filing there where they have the 75,000 in damages, like that basically just comes down to like the research team who like, oh, we have a vulnerability and they had to go and figure out what it was. That's what they're trying to have covered here. Is they estimated a cost of damages just being about 75,000. I did find it interesting that they also mentioned between April 29th and May 10th of 2019, there were 1,400 devices attacked by Pegasus with this vulnerability. And like, that's not a very long period of time.
For a pretty large number of devices
Like,
as far as targeted attacks go.
yeah, like that's like 100 attacks a day, pretty much. I mean, I'm ballparking that slightly because it would technically be a little bit more because I don't think that's even 2 weeks' time.
Yeah. So we talked about this a little bit before we started recording, and I thought that was interesting too, because when you have like a tight set of dates like that, to me, that seems like it's a specific campaign that they're referencing. And I tried going through and seeing like if, Citizen Lab or Amnesty International or anything like that had documented a campaign in that time window, and I couldn't really find anything. That said, I didn't look super hard or anything. Maybe there is like a specific campaign they're referencing here, but yeah, the dates are interesting as well as the number. Like,
Okay, so I just pulled up the document here again, and now I'm only reading April to May 2019. I'm pretty sure I saw like the 29th somewhere in here. If I can search it. Okay, yeah. Between I found it. It's just a little bit later. And yeah, in an effort to infect approximately 1,400 target devices. So that's not even like, one user 1,400 times. That's 1,400 targeted
unique
users include
devices. Yeah.
attorneys, journalists, human rights activists, political dissidents, diplomats, other senior foreign government officials. Not really that surprising. And I mean, this is all from their original, or from like the original filing here. It is a higher number than I would have expected because we often talk about there being a certain degree of discretion when it comes to dropping O days on targets, and not wanting to burn them.
And actually, this is a really good point that, so jumping back a little bit to that CCC talk, from Pegasus to Predator. So of course they talk a little bit about Pegasus there as well, and the different iterations of it. But one of the points they bring up is the fact that they would like to see more like academic research and studies done into commercial spyware and how it's deployed, because for the most part, everybody's just guessing. You can't really get like concrete or like things you can point to for actual numbers of which types of people are targeted, how many of them are targeted, at what rate or pace. Like there's just not really that information. It's just kind of educated guessing from experts in the field, which, in some cases is good enough, but it does make drawing conclusions and stuff very difficult. So 1,400 does seem surprising to me, but maybe that's just because my view on it isn't accurate enough.
Yeah, so the information just doesn't really exist though. Cause like you'll have, say, people with devices that end up getting referenced off to like Citizen Lab or something, where generally my understanding of that flow is basically Microsoft, Google, whoever will have like a support contract with some companies. They're providing phones to, journalist organization, government. Well, I mean, maybe not providing phones, but like maybe they have service like Android, or not Android, what's that called? Like G Suite services or Workspace or whatever they call it. Or like with Microsoft, they'll have like that sort of agreement, and then they'll find some sort of issue like, hey, our phone's crashing or whatever. And then Microsoft or Google will be like, this looks like vulnerability. You should pass this off to Citizen Lab or one of those other companies for an actual forensic investigation. And, from that information, like that's already missing a lot of information about what other attacks were going on.
Yeah, you can never get like completely accurate figures when it comes to like, because this is essentially espionage area. You're never going to get concrete facts and anything like that. But
just require the government
there's like
report
no studies. But like there's no like studies even really from an academia that even like try to look at it too in depth. So yeah, it's just really hard to even get like ballpark numbers.
Like, I feel like the only group that could do that would be if something like Google's Tag. I don't know if Microsoft has any similar organization. They feel like the only ones that would be in a position where they could actually say, we see like X number of attacks. Or like, WhatsApp could say we see X number of attacks of like this sort of thing. They would have to put that out there, and I feel like it looks bad for them to put anything out, therefore they're not going to. But like, I don't think it's a problem. Basically, what I'm getting at is I don't think it's a problem on academia. I think it's a problem on the organizations that actually have.
Sorry, I wasn't trying to say it's only like academia's fault or something. But that is just one area that the person giving the presentation had called out as like something that could be a good way to improve state of like counter surveillance in mobile. But another thing that he had brought up that I think is kind
Just
of
before you
relevant here.
switch off, actually, I just want to kind of agree with that and say, like, I do think more of a light should be shone on what's going on and making people aware of what like governments are doing, because these are generally government actors, on the fact that these campaigns are happening, but like actual details about it, not just, oh yeah, there's like 1,000 attacks, but like specifics. I think would be
Yeah,
valuable to make people aware of what's going on.
yeah,
Sorry, you can.
yeah. I guess I think there probably should be a little bit more like accountability and transparency around it. It's been a long time now where like it's been, you know, uh, we don't talk about this. Like nobody wants to talk about it at all. And I think there should be a little bit of visibility into it beyond what exists currently. Um, but
I see it kind
yeah,
of like
that's
the
just kind of my views
military.
on it.
I'm not against have like here in Canada we have a military. I'm not against Canada having and deploying a military. I don't want that military deployed without reason. In Syria we do have like some of our special forces get deployed somewhat secretively. That I think there needs to be oversight over, but like that's the thing. A lot of this tends to feel like it exists without a lot of oversight.
Yeah, without a lot of checks and balances. Um,
And so, like, I think just even if you want to be in support of it, I think it's also just part of, the espionage game, the spy game,
yeah,
that, the NGOs, whatever, are able to fight back against it a little bit and shine the light and share that information. And I think that is just part of it. Like, I don't
yeah,
think they exist
yeah.
as,
It comes
like,
with the territory.
counter to. I'm kind of, in a sense, supportive of both.
Yeah, yeah. I would. Yeah, that's a fair way to put it for me as well. But yeah, the other thing I was going to get into was beyond just the studies. Um, companies now I'm talking specifically about Apple here because that's what he talked about in the presentation. But there isn't a lot of great tooling or like built-in functionality for actually seeing like indicators of compromise. You do have like apps that try to do like checks of the file system or something like that, but it's very naive. And because of the lockdown nature of Apple and iOS specifically, a lot of the time if you want to try to see if you've been compromised, you have to take like backups and analyze them or put them through tooling, or you have to leverage just tooling that's not very accessible to the people that would be targeted for mobile espionage. So it's kind of that problem too, where it's hard to do those studies and whatnot when it's so inaccessible to actually analyze and find indicators of compromise in mobile. And that's something that Apple's been criticized for a long time, is they've put a lot of effort into doing like exploit mitigation and like anti jailbreak measures, but when it comes to introspection to actually try to detect spyware and whatnot, they haven't really done a lot on that front. And it seems like there is a bit of frustration with that on the counter surveillance side of things. But yeah, it makes it hard to get those numbers too.
Yeah, that's kind of a challenging thing though, because that's part of their security. That is,
It is. And
they
there's like a
enhance their
balance to
security.
strike there. Yeah.
Yeah, they enhance security by doing that. We've kind of talked before how, information tends to, in the balance of power, tends to benefit, I think, the security research by having things more accessible.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, having things hidden benefits the attackers more than anybody.
yeah, because they're the ones that, are going to be more willing and able to invest time to break that or to spend the time to figure out the secrets or whatever. Uh, but yeah, it's challenging because that's kind of part of the core security of a lot of phones is like that you can't just jailbreak them, that they do have these extra steps necessary in order to get access in that way. And, if they were to just provide it, it's kind of why, like Windows, it's generally pretty easy to do that. And thus also kind of easier to write malware on, for example. It doesn't take like days to do it. It can generally be done a lot more trivially. Um, I can agree with the sentiment, but I'm not sure. And generally, I do think there should be more ways of having some sort of introspection, even if it's not necessarily a runtime thing. Having a better option for obvious and loud introspection, like something that I think it's the Pixel phones. If you like unlock the bootloader, it warns you every time you boot up the bootloader's been unlocked, or having like an unsigned firmware OS installed, or like using the development keys or whatever. It warns you about that very loudly, but it lets you do it.
Yeah.
And I feel like there could be some sort of trade-off more in that realm that would allow the introspection, but also making it loud that it's kind of there rather than just transparently part of the system. But that's not something I've really thought a lot about. So I'm sure I'll have somebody who can correct me and be like, no, actually, that is a terrible idea. And fair enough. That's just first thing
Yeah,
that
some
comes
people
to
have
mind.
there's some people who have very strong opinions on that in the space. It's something I kind of thought about when we got into that discussion of like the 1400 number.
Yeah, it's a higher number than I expected, especially in such a short period. It almost feels like to me, and I have no way of knowing if this is correct or not, but of course Pegasus is a software command and control implant, all of that provided by
Solution.
NSO Group.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's this whole all-in-one solution provided to generally nation states by NSO Group. I could kind of just imagine it's like, hey guys, like putting out the ad, everybody on Discord, hey guys, new feature, you can compromise through WhatsApp now. And just, having a bunch of their clients jump on and start launching their attacks because it's this new feature. I don't think that's necessarily what goes on. That feels like the sort of thing that would require a substantial extra purchase or something. But I I don't know. I kind of
It's
imagine
hard to
that
get
sort of
visibility into
situation
that,
too.
but it could be, yeah. But yeah, I mean, so it's always tricky talking about like the legal topics, especially where kind of like I said, we're idiots, so to speak, when it comes to like legal speak. Like neither of us have any legal background, but it is worth keeping an eye on just because of the fact that CFAA is kind of a wide sweeping tool that like hammer that can be used to beat researchers with. When you see it being argued in cases, it's hard not to follow it and keep up with it a little bit. um and like it's one we've talked about before, so I figured it is worth covering how that has kind of ended, although as he said, it hasn't ended, but the interesting stuff to us has kind of ended. And yeah, it's a good thing that I guess the judgment kind of circumvented CFAA, like the ruling of how CFAA could apply there. Some of the arguments were pretty interesting, and there was discussion in our Discord, especially around like the TOS, breaking of like TOS. And it is like a common thing that I've seen even outside of this case, just in general. A lot of people seem to think that violating companies' terms of service is some kind of like legal grounds to sue them, and like that's not really the case.
You may be
The
able to
terms of service
sue.
are.
It just shouldn't be a Computer Fraud and Abuse Act issue. Um,
Yeah. Sorry,
because there are
it's
other
not a CF.
laws.
It shouldn't be a CFAA violation, just a TOS violation. So
Yeah, like because and essentially where courts have come is like just the terms of service violation is effectively letting companies write the law, which they don't want to allow. So yeah, generally speaking, like just terms of service has not been sufficient. You need something more going on. And yeah, we've covered some others. We covered with the Van Bruin case, for example, when that hit the Supreme Court, which I think is the only CFA course to hit or to reach the Supreme Court. Covered that a while back. I forget exactly when, but
yeah,
yeah, I don't know. I keep my eye on this stuff. Obviously, I'm not sitting there wanting like NSO Group to win, but I am wanting to see some restraint when it comes down to the judgment. And on a whole, like I have some concerns with this, but it feels like they sidestepped a lot of my concerns.
yeah. All right, so I think we can get into our next post here, which is by Sonar. And they made a post summarizing their research highlights from 2024. And we decided to include this. I was a little on the fence at first because it is like specifically from Sonar that they're talking about. But we've covered a lot of Sonar posts last year on the podcast because they had a lot of really good research coming out. So, it feels kind of fair to let them like link off to a lot of their good research because they did have a lot of it.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of when I had this post, there was kind of that feeling of, well, this is just Sonar stuff here. At the same time, they have had a solid year. This has probably been the year where I've actually taken notice of their research coming out. I'm not sure if maybe I just have missed a lot of their research in the past or if they've actually started putting more emphasis on it. Because I know I've had their blog sitting in like our feed list for quite a while, but this year more so than others, they put out like some very good content. So yeah, I mean they have a few things here we've talked about. I know I talked about the SQL injection isn't dead, smuggling queries at the protocol level is a DEF CON talk, and then we didn't talk about the Hexacon talk, but we did cover the blog post of exploiting file rights hardened environments. Yeah. Some of these other ones we did not cover, but nonetheless, they put out some really good stuff this year. So honestly, they're kind of my highlight for the year, like just as a blog, as not really like a new discovery, but like as a new source, they've been great this year.
Yeah, and it's cool too because a lot of the time with companies you'll see them kind of focus on one or two specific targets, and you'll see like a fair amount of research coming out of that and then just like silence until the next one. But their coverage has covered quite a bit of different projects. Like they mentioned they've looked at Jenkins, SourceForge, Roundcube, Mailspring, some different CMS like Joomla. They have a coverage of around quite a few different like categories and products, which again is something that I don't feel like is super common just
And like
from what I've seen.
variety, like MXs,
Yeah.
they've had a number of bugs around like MXS, which is very much a research topic and like like it's not just beginner content, and a lot of their stuff doesn't feel like it's just an advertisement for Sonar Source. So I can tell you going into this year, I didn't exactly have a great uh I don't know, reputation. Like they didn't have a great reputation in my mind as like just their general tooling and stuff. It's been quite a while since I've only used them a handful of times, so it's not like I had like a really meaningful thought on them, but still. Uh yeah, no, they've had a lot of good content that is simply good. It's not yeah, Sonar Source, like their product has come up in it,
Yeah. I mean,
but
it's
it's
fair to
never
bring
front and
up
center.
because there's a few times where we've went through blog posts of research, and a lot of the time you are kind of disappointed because it is basically an advertisement for their proprietary tool that is like really expensive. It's not really like research that you can read and take away things from very much beyond how you can use their tool. So when you see, a company break away from that uh, sort of convention, it's very cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, they've got a bunch of things here flaked out that you give a read. Like I said, we've covered a fair number of them, and some of them have been things that we decided not to cover. Mostly, I think, just because we had a lot of other good topics sometimes.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, I don't think we've ever really not covered them because it was just a terrible post. At least nothing comes to mind. So there's just some good stuff to give a read here. And I guess kind of on similar vibe. I will mention that Portswigger does have their top 10 web hacking techniques of 2024 nominations open. And that page also ends up providing you a list of, things that other people thought were, worthy of being the top 10. This is just the nominations right now. So, yeah, that's another list of things you can go read if you feel like it or you want some more reading, see what you missed for the year.
Sorry, I was just looking at the next post. Was this post from 2016? Is that right?
I guess so.
Do we still want to cover it? I didn't realize it was that old.
Neither did
Uh,
I, but honestly, I mean, it's not like this was a vulnerability, so yeah, let's.
yeah,
I
I mean,
mean,
it was
basically,
shared around recently, but
yeah, it hit Hacker News very recently, um, and that's where I saw it. So yeah, I mean, I didn't notice this was 2016 until you said so, but at the same time, this is still a pretty solid
yeah,
and interesting post, and there's nothing really in here that's going to be like, oh, today you could have just done this. Like maybe I guess on some of the tooling you could have changed it.
Yeah.
LLVM's a little bit more established. Maybe get something in with that, but yeah. No, on a whole, I'm good with covering it. So
Okay. So yeah, I mean, we have a post from Unity blog, and it is a little bit old. It's from 2016, and I didn't really realize that at first. It's kind of really like small text and everything, but it was shared around on Hacker News recently, which is why it kind of came up on our radar recently. But it's called Debugging Memory Corruption: Who Wrote 2 into My Stack. And like Z kind of said there, it's not a vulnerability or an exploit or anything like that, but it does go into like triaging a vulnerability and trying to root cause it, which is, or sorry, not a vulnerability, triaging a bug and trying to root cause it, which a lot of that will transfer over pretty well. So this was a bug report that came from a Unity game developer. It ultimately, the bug was from the IL to CPP backend, which is like their intermediate language to C++. So I believe this is used for taking something like C# and then you could compile it to C++. When they got the crash, they tried looking at the stack trace and WinDebug, saw it was corrupted. It only showed like one address, which was invalid memory. And after digging into it a little bit more, trying to recover the stack trace from memory, they decided to create stack sentinels. So basically all they did there was they would put some buffer in an object that goes on the stack, write some tagged values there, and then on destruction, it would check if those values were changed, basically like a sanitizer.
it did feel a little
And
bit off to me, like why they wouldn't have used Stack Canary here.
yeah,
And
because
ultimately, I
ultimately what
think,
was causing the crash was a return address override. So a stack canary should have caught it too.
yeah, although my thinking is that kind of the route they end up going for the introspection stuff, I'm guessing perhaps just canaries, because you're only really going to pick up on the canary on return specifically. That maybe wasn't going to be sufficient to find when it happened, because the write didn't really happen relevant to the return at all.
Yeah, yeah, could have been.
So I think could have been that way, but that was kind of my initial thought. That's just kind of my head canon. It's not really explained why they went this route versus something else, but it's still like, and that actually made this a little bit more interesting to me, is it's a different solution than I would have reached for initially. um and obviously they have a very different development background than I do.
Yeah. So that did end up working. They were able to change the behavior from a crash to an assertion failure via that check. And they had found that this static value of 2 was always being written into the buffer to corrupt it, which is a little strange, especially 2 as a value. It's pretty out there. But after doing some more troubleshooting and debugging from userland, they just couldn't figure out where this corruption was really coming from. And they eventually speculated that maybe the kernel is somehow involved in this corruption. And that was pretty spot on. What they ended up finding was uh, in their socket pulling code, they would call the select function, which basically monitors and waits on a socket to be operable for some operation. Windows kind of like emulates that and implements it with NT system calls. And since it blocks, they need to interrupt and get a new socket processed. And to do that, they use this queue user APC function. The problem is when an exception is thrown, the stack would unwind. And later on, when that asynchronous work had finished, the NT device IO control files this call would write the result in an IO status block on the stack, but the stack was unwound. So in the case of a crash, it was overwriting the return address on the stack with the status of the select syscall, which happened to be this 2 value. So it's very like it's an interesting case where you have kernel API. Now it's not like a kernel bug that's causing user corruption. It's more of a misuse of the kernel API, but it's sort of a great like example of how misuse of kernel API can cause these really cumbersome problems, especially when you have an exception being thrown in the context of invoking a syscall. That was kind of their main like takeaway and call to action, I guess, was to be careful of doing that. But it's great for showing how difficult debugging can be and some of the ways you can try to work around that if you're in a case of a difficult bug to triage. And I think that is very transferable to vuln research as well.
Yeah, I mean, this very much feels like sort of steps that you may end up taking when it comes to trying to triage a crash. Yeah, creating your own, if you're on like a black box situation, you may not be able to create your own stack sentinel and do that route, but you may be able to instrument something in there. So like there are options for that. Yeah, I thought it was a really great read just about the process, and I'm actually slightly more impressed now knowing it's like, nearly a decade old now,
Yeah.
working with different tooling and all of that. But yeah, honestly, it was just a good read. So I kind of wanted to add it for that. I didn't even take note of the date. So the bug itself, like it is the sort of thing that you see a little bit with Windows stuff. You maybe want to avoid an allocation, so you're using the stack, you forget, but that would ends up unwinding because of the exceptions, which is just kind of a whole thing about exceptions. And there's unwinding can cause issues in general, but this is kind of also just the case of passing stack memory and having it outlive the stack frame. A little bit less obvious because the only reason it outlived was because of the unwinding. Uh, but still, like, had this been a heap backed block of memory, wouldn't have even had an issue. Just would have had the performance hit of using the heap.
Yeah, one thing I'm finding interesting, just looking into the history of the blog post because I'm really curious. I went on Wayback Machine and there's like no captures of the page before August of 2024. I believe the reason Hacker News had picked this up was because Alex Plaskett had tweeted out about it on December 31st. So yeah, I don't know if it was just kind of this hidden gem that was just like buried in the Unity blog, but
The URL could have changed over time, though, too. That is.
yeah, it could be something like that for sure. But yeah, I mean, still, even though it's old, it's still very relevant. Yeah, a lot of the stuff it talks about is kind of timeless in that respect. So
Yeah.
it's still pretty cool. Yeah. All right. So I believe that is all the hard topics we have. We do have a few shout outs to get into.
Yeah, I mean,
So
hard topics. We didn't really have any hard topics this week. We
yeah,
had a lot of
yeah,
soft topics, a lot of new stuff, but some good
yeah,
discussion.
yeah. So I'll let you get into them, Z, because you kind of noticed both of them, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, although the first shout out is a little bit of a hard topic. It's about hardware hacking, specifically HardBreak.wiki, which looks to be a fairly new wiki coming up with the goal of being kind of introductory content on hardware hacking. Wiki got some stuff on the basics. Now, I've said this many times in covering hardware hacking, but it is not an area that I am an expert in, so I'm not great when it comes to trying to judge the content. But Spectre, I did ask you to take a look, and you at least said like it didn't seem crazy.
Yeah, so the kind of angle that they're taking with their wiki is for choosing targets that are like IoT, so like routers, especially ones that are older and likely don't have a lot of hardening and mitigations and stuff. So just kind of taking you through like, so here's what you would do if you like put a router down on your desk and wanted to start researching it. So you would take it apart, you'd start looking at like the chips and the board layout, try to look for headers for various common protocols like UART, JTAG, things like that, and just kind of walks you through how you would do that process and some of the things that you could look for, as well as some like recommendations for tooling and some hardware that you might want. For example, like having a bus pirate can be very useful for trying to look at some of the connections and sniffing traffic and stuff like that, as well as some like logic analyzer and oscilloscope recommendations, which is something that I think is valuable because that is probably the most common question I see whenever people are looking to get into hardware hacking is like, okay, what tools do I need? And that sometimes sparks a bit of a, you know, culture war, I guess, or like, people arguing on which is the best tooling, but really it's just it is a good set of recommendations. I think the information they have here is very basic. One thing that I would be careful of is the fact that they don't make it super obvious, but this kind of naive approach, so to speak, of looking like trying to dump firmware and everything is only really going to work on some of those older devices that aren't really hardened at all. They don't really talk about being able to spot encryption or how you can try to deal with that or ways to deal with that. It just kind of assumes that you're able to extract it in plain text. Um, So yeah, like it doesn't get too advanced on any of that or anything. They also talk a little bit about like fault injection and stuff, but again, very surface level. It doesn't go into depth on that. So it is very much a beginner oriented wiki, but still, if you are in that category and looking to break into hardware research, I think this wiki does centralize a fair amount of information that would be useful to you.
Yeah, fair enough. Like I said, I don't necessarily, or I can't really judge a lot of that. I figured the only tool you needed was a flipper zero, so you know.
Might be right. You might be right.
Yeah, but yeah, it is a wiki. I believe it is on Git, so like if you want to add to it, you can also. So there's that option too. Yeah, edit on GitHub. I see the link over here, so you can always make a PR there. The second shout out I've got is yet another CodeQL thing. Um, I won't spend too much time on this, but announcing CodeQL community packs. One of the issues with CodeQL, work with it, is there's sometimes a lot of kind of boilerplate you need to write. Where if you're working with one library, you need to kind of like notate all of these certain functions, and you'll write like matchers for these input functions, or these are like your sources, these are like your sinks for this library, because that changes from library to library, and like maybe need to write like the additional taint steps or something like that too. And so with the community packs, this is just basically just a repository that they're putting out there for anybody to add to. They're not actually providing a ton in it yet, so hopefully it'll build out to something. But the idea being that you could do some of this work committed into a community pack, and so then the community can benefit from, like, hey, this popular framework we've already written, or somebody's already written these parts of it, so you can just borrow that instead of needing to kind of rewrite the same code, perhaps poorly, perhaps not, but instead of needing to redo some of that same work time and time again. My initial glance at it, it didn't seem like they were really providing very much. But maybe that just had to do with the languages that I chose to take a look at here. Yeah, like I see a handful of things existing in here. But yeah, they're announcing it, they're putting it out there. It is a central place for some of that, so hopefully it'll build up and get more added in there. So there definitely is some benefit to that. That is one of the harder part. Well, not necessarily harder parts. It is one of the more tedious parts of CodeQL, is needing to write the boilerplate. So that'll maybe help with that. I will say that's part of what's supposed to be in these community packs. That's more like the modeling packs. They do have some other queries, library packs, containing like essential components to analysis and stuff. There's a little bit more to it. That was the main takeaway for me, but there is a little bit more.
But yeah, that concludes everything we have for this episode. So as always, thanks goes out to everyone who tuned in. We do have quite a few of like write-ups and vulnerabilities to also cover. We just split it off from this episode because we didn't want it to get too long. So yeah, we will be getting back into more of those kinds of topics next week, and we'll see you then.